Welcome to RCR Wireless News. I'm Martha DeGrasse, and I'm here today with Steve Kemp. He is Manager of Small Cell Site Solutions for CommScope. Steve, thanks so much for making the time today.
Oh, sure, Martha.
We are starting to see mobile operators invest more in outdoor small cell solutions, and we're starting to see some real deployments come online this year. So I'd like to get your perspective on what some of the key challenges that operators are solving with these solutions are.
Well, as we pass through, and I'll say pass through, the phase of small cells where it was, first field trials, and then of course, trying to address some point coverage areas. I mean, the first thing to go after was clearly coverage, because that was one of the places that, where you're trying to fix things, where you're suffering KPI issues. And we're starting to see people move past that now that they've got their feet wet with small cells, and start to go on to address capacity issues. And I've seen quite a bit of those lately, where it is, pinpoint, if you will, capacity fixes for the network, where maybe they get the network gets overloaded or experiences a surge because of some particular location. I've seen applications, matter of fact, permitting applications, where it was obvious as right across a particular venue that would be crowded on a Friday or a Saturday night, and it was a great way to just throw in a small cell and try to relieve that sector of the network. And so we've watched it migrate from, let's see if we can fix the coverage holes, although we're still doing that to large extent, but now also picking up capacity opportunities as well.
So you say just throw in a small cell. You make it sound easy, but we know it isn't.
Yeah, we all thought it was going to be easy like 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah. Quite the contrary. Sometimes they can be a lot simpler than others, and I'll pick on joint-owned utility poles. That tends to be a favored location, because at least it's a known quantity. Your space on the pole. I know how much the pole is going to cost, or how much monthly you have to pay for the pole. There's some things that deal with in the public rights of way versus outside the public rights of way. If I'm outside the public rights of way and happen to be on a wood pole, I can tend to do things I get a little bit more liberty there in a lot of cases than I would, let's say, if you're on the corner of State Madison in Chicago. You get down into an area like that, it is all going to be, a lot of it's going to hinge on whether there's actual real estate there to put something. It's going to have to fit in with the environment. There is going to be a permitting process. It's probably going to go through several iterations of trial and error vis-a-vis the photo simulations that have to be done to see if everybody's going to be happy with the look and feel. So as far as simply throw a small cell onto a pole, sometimes it could happen, but I think as we start to progress through time, those opportunities will be cherry picked. And when we're having this conversation 5 years from now, it's going to be totally different ball game with dense urban areas and a larger scale.
Okay, so you've just described a lot of different processes and costs that have nothing to do with the actual equipment or the make ready for that equipment. So can you just give us a little bit of an overview of how operators look at these costs in terms of, how much is upfront CapEx, how much is deployment of that equipment, and how much is working with the city, and then the ongoing maintenance, lease costs, et cetera?
The lease cost is a little bit different animal, but I'll break it out broadly as follows. I mean, from our experience and what we've seen in quotes that we've done, and of course, CommScope does services as well as, services and installation, as well as the equipment side of the equation. And I know a little bit about what the cost of the radio equipment is, but proportionately, it's probably a third equipment, a third installation, and then probably a third of everything else, like 3 times through the permitting cycle at $3,000 a throw or something. So I mean, there's quite a bit of money that is everything else. The OpEx side of the equation, all depends upon how much power the radios are going to take. What we've seen. So let's back up a couple of years ago. If you would have said small cells, if you would have said metrocells, you would have been referring to a 5-watt radio, and in many cases you would have been referring to a maybe even a 2-watt radio. What we've seen is, especially with Cloud RAN, is this progression towards the use of higher wattage radios. And of course, they're bigger, they draw more power. And so the OpEx side of the equation changes, but be that as it may, power is still not the worst problem. The worst problem is actually site leasing, procurement of the property, et cetera. So that's the big, that is the big part of it. And that is certainly the long pole in the tent when it comes to building one of these sites. Certainly backhaul power mentioned as the two big obstacles, but I'll put site acquisition in there, and writing a lease agreement and getting all that done is, probably the longest pole in the tent.
Right, and probably the most variable cost as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about,
and it varies very widely because, attachment rights on a wood pole can be $2 a month versus, $4,000 a year for a street pole, right?
Right. And it's not always on a pole, though. I think there are some other solutions and some other ways that people are concealing the small cells. Can you give us a little information about that?
Yeah, we've seen all sorts. We've seen them on poles. We've seen them on the ground. We've seen them. I divided up into the following kind of categories loosely, if you will. If you look at dense urban areas, you will find spots that are in the public rights of way that are going to be difficult, and sometimes that involves ground-mounted equipment where the cable runs over to an antenna that happens to be located on a pole, whether it's a light pole or some other kind of pole. And then there's the instance where it would be, sorry about that little interruption, it popped on my screen. And so there's the instance where it could be on a, like I say, joint use pole, joint wood utility pole, that is close to public rights of way, right within public view. You worry about, concealing, you have to worry about concealing the equipment in that case, because it's, it might be next to a historic district, it might be next to housing, and people don't want to look at, equipment, hanging all over a pole. So you have to figure out how to disguise it. And then there is the, out in the open area, we've seen, where they have to go into, almost in an area where there's trees, and all sorts of situations. So there's ground-based situations. There's places where you put the small cells, attach them to something, attach them to a pole. We've seen small cells go on rooftops, although I can't say that that's the dominant case. The dominant case tends to be located on a wood pole, because 75% of what you find out there is wood poles, and it can either be on a wood pole or it can be a cabinet that is sometimes along. We've got some that are going into city centers soon that will be cabinets that are actually mounted on the street. So they come in all sorts of different, shapes and flavors. And of course, the lowest cost option, if you will, is take some banding material out, just strap it to the pole. And then beyond that, once you start disguising it, you have to, be concerned about, is it in the public rights of way? Is it viewable? Is it subject to, to snow plows, things like that? The cost and, the prettiness, all that starts driving the price of the small cell up. The site starts going up and up from there.
Okay, great. Are there any cost-effective tricks that you've learned that for concealment that are, where it is blending in a little more, but it's not costing an arm and a leg?
Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, and this is kind of a movement in the industry, you see, is trying to get to the point where the equipment that has to be housed in a cabinet is in a cabinet, and the radios, there are certain elements that are in the small cells. We introduced a solution late last year where we took anything that was IP65, IP, outdoor rated equipment. We don't have to worry about protecting it in a cabinet. We typically can shroud it with just, metal casement, and at least make the site look homogeneous, make the site just look, like one streamlined site instead of multiple radios and some backhaul equipment and diplexers and all that just hanging all over the pole. And so we see that both in the 5-watt arena, where we're doing that with 5-watt metrocells, and we've seen it lately. It's starting to, become a value in the radio head, section, where we actually had these radio heads are actually much bigger than 5-watt radios, and so they have to be put inside of a shroud. And putting them inside of the shroud just leverages the fact that the radio is already outdoor hardened and outdoor protected. So all you're doing is, putting a kind of a disguise around it. It's no different than putting some kind of facade around, a cell site that happens to be on a roof. So that's probably the most economic way to, kind of put these things. It really gets down to the economies of deploying these things is, of course, location. And as you get into these places that are very difficult to kind of blend in, Market Street in San Francisco, right, where you're trying to be the least obtrusive as possible, is, obviously the cost of the solution gets, becomes more and more and more. And in some of these cases where we actually have to go out and replace, we're now looking at, doing complete lamppost replacements. They don't look quite like a lamppost, but it's better than nothing. And so basically you replace a whole light pole with these things in dense urban areas. But we're enter into the fray, like construction of the foundation, pulling the old pole out. In some of these wood pole cases, there's even, pole replacement. There's relocation of power lines and things like that. So it is, because they are very small radius devices, generally, anywhere between 5 and 10 watts, you have to hit the longitude of where these things go fairly precise. I mean, it's not as sloppy as you can be off by half mile and everything's going to be fine. I mean, you got to be pretty precise. When that's the case, then you're kind of stuck with where you put them and how much you're going to have to spend to put them in that particular location.
Okay. All right. Great. Anything else that you want to be sure that we get from this discussion, Steve? Anything else?
Well, we spent a lot of time, as that we saw in small cells, certainly was the initial, I'd say 5-6 years ago, when people thought of small cells. Oftentimes they thought of them with integrated antennas. And of course, Andrew CommScope is, one of being in antennas, right? We spent a lot of time with antennas, and we spent a lot of time early on with small cells proving to the market, and I think quite successfully, that the higher grade antennas and the techniques that we use in macro deployment, such as electrical down tilt and upper side lobe suppression, those techniques are very valuable, just as valuable in small cells, because LTE is obviously a noise, very sensitive to noise versus previous technologies. And so it's in your best interest if you get the noise down. When you get the noise down, you can improve the network performance, and if you can improve the network throughput, right, which is what you're trying to get out of the small cell to begin with. What we found is that we can typically expect that the performance is somewhere around 25, 30% greater than just taking a little stick antenna and just spraying the RF all over the place, because you waste a lot of energy in the in the beam width of a lousy or grade antenna, for lack of better words. So you go to a higher grade antenna and you control that beam width. You can expect the performance go up, and when the performance goes up, consequently, the number of sites that you actually need to do the same job goes down. So either you can keep the same number of sites and improve the performance 27%, or and of course elect to choose fewer sites. So either way, the use of higher grade RF path equipment is obviously beneficial in small cells as much as it is in a macro environment.
Excellent. All right. Steve Kemp, Manager of Small Cell Site Solutions at CommScope. Thanks very much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Martha. I appreciate you having me. Bye now.
We'll talk to you soon.